Statement, and I call the member for Denison.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, there's no doubt that the situation in Iraq is dire. To quote Amnesty International, the Islamic State is carrying out despicable crimes and has transformed rural areas of Sinjar into blood-soaked killing fields in its brutal campaign to obliterate all traces of non-Arabs and non-Sunni Muslims. I agree that the international community must act, and must act quickly. And indeed, I'm open-minded about what shape that action should take, even though I think many people would be aware of my strident opposition to the war more broadly, and in particular opposition to Australia's decision to join in the invasion in 2003, which started this war. Deputy Speaker, my concern today is twofold. Firstly, how did Australia help to create this mess that we're now forced to deal with? How did we get ourselves into this mess? And my second concern is how do we properly go about dealing with it? What are the proper processes for government and of the parliament to make the decisions, the best decisions, to now come up with the best solutions? Deputy Speaker, regarding how we got into this mess, let's not forget that Australia helped to start this war 11.5 years ago when we joined in the invasion of Iraq. We removed Saddam Hussein, we dismantled their administration, and we disbanded the Iraqi military. In fact, what we did starting 11.5 years ago is we helped to create the vacuum which was subsequently filled by terrible violence. The vacuum that very much is being filled today in parts of Iraq by the Islamic State. And Deputy Speaker, today's tragedy is all the more tragic because it didn't need to be this way. There were other ways to deal with the odious Saddam Hussein 11.5 years ago. For example, giving the weapons inspectors the extra time that they were asking for to search for these weapons of mass destruction. But instead, what did the Australian government do? And in particular, then Prime Minister John Howard, supporting by then Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. They built a framework of lies to justify us joining in the start of this 11.5-year war. People would well remember the nonsense about Iraq had a massive arsenal of weapons of mass destruction and that it was cooperating actively with Osama bin Laden, and it was only a matter of time before those deadly weapons would be passed to the terrorists and used against us. Remember all the talk that Iraq could launch missiles at the United Kingdom within 40 minutes. All of these stories were subsequently debunked and found to be false. More recently, Deputy Speaker, we've made more mistakes. Australia, of course, has been, diplomatically at least, a very strong supporter of the anti-Assad rebels in Syria. Part of those rebels was and is the Islamic State. So for quite a long period of time now, the Gillard government, then the brief Rudd government, and now the Abbott government have been giving succour to the very people who are now causing the problems in Iraq. Deputy Speaker, no wonder then, given the history of this, that many people are questioning and restless about what we're doing and, in fact, whether we're doing the right thing. That helps to explain the position of many people, which I hope to represent faithfully, the position of many people that decisions like this really need to be decisions for the parliament. You know, there is, I suggest, no more serious decision for a country than to go to war. And we are in a war now. In fact, some of the dishonesty is already emerging in recent days, talking about we're involved in more humanitarian missions in Iraq. Well, you know, the military would say that flying munitions and weapons around a battlefield is combat support. It is a key part of war fighting. So I reject the notion that what we're now doing is humanitarian. We are providing combat support operations for the Kurds, and it needs to be seen as that. Now, that may well be, with the approval of the parliament, the vast majority of the parliament, perhaps including myself, if it was to be put to a vote. But let's be honest with the Australian people about what we're now involved in. Hence I make the point, and I've been saying this consistently for some time now, The decision to go to war and the decision to commit troops or military forces to a war zone, to put them in harm's way, really should be taken out of the hands of the Prime Minister. It really should be a decision for the Parliament. Now, when I've said this publicly in previous days, the Prime Minister has described what I've been saying, my suggestion, as a novel idea, Deputy Speaker. Well, I reject that criticism, or at least observation, by the Prime Minister. It is not novel to have the Parliament directly involved in decisions about war and peace and sending troops or military forces to war. In fact, it's already the law of the land in countries as diverse as Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and even in the United States. It is their law that the Congress be involved in making decisions about sending troops into a conflict and certainly declaring war. Now, yes, in the United States, sometimes presidents ignore that requirement, but it is their law. So if it's good enough for these countries that we hold in high regard, why do we in Australia still have this, this historical oddity, I suppose you'd call it, where the Prime Minister can act virtually unilaterally and take us to war, as was the case in 2003 when John Howard virtually unilaterally took us to war in Iraq. Even in the UK, Deputy Speaker, it has become the convention that the House of Commons will be involved in decisions about becoming involved in a conflict. And it's very telling that last year, British Prime Minister David Cameron took it to the House of Commons whether or not Britain should provide material support to the rebels in Syria. And the House of Commons, in what was a stunning defeat for the British Prime Minister, voted that down. Well, it might have been a stunning defeat for the British Prime Minister, but I think it was a triumph for democracy in the United Kingdom and something we should seek to emulate, because the House of Commons decided that it would be a bad idea to provide support to the Syrian rebels, part of which is the Islamic State, which we're now battling in Iraq. Deputy Speaker, I make the point again, the situation is dire, we need to do something, and I'm open-minded about what we do. But isn't it a crying shame that we helped to create this mess in the first place? Isn't it a crying shame that we live in an otherwise wonderful country, but we still allow our Prime Minister to make decisions as weighty as this? In closing, Deputy Speaker, I think this issue highlights that the government is not as strong on national security as it would like us to believe. The fact that it is not allowing a proper parliamentary debate on this matter, instead shunting us up here to the Federation Chamber, where it will end with a whimper and there won't be a vote in the main chamber. I think the government is letting us down on national security by handling it this way. Just as I think more broadly the government is letting us down in some other areas on national security. The government is understandably wanting to progress some reforms to our security legislation, many of which are very good reforms. But when those suggestions came to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security and the committee reported last year, the committee in fact recommended that any reforms be prepared in detail, put into an exposure draft, put out for public comment and stakeholder consultation and subject to proper parliamentary scrutiny, and that's not going to happen. Another misstep, despite all of the talk about homegrown terrorism and the fact that terrorists look for soft targets, we know that, the government is withdrawing the federal police from my own home state of Tasmania and Hobart Airport. Another misstep by the government. But I hope by highlighting these things publicly I can encourage the government to look to rectify these things. In closing, Deputy Speaker, all I can say is, we can but hope that things turn quickly for the better for the Iraqi people. A decade of UN sanctions, followed by 11.5 years of war, continuing violently to this day, have cost the lives of millions of Iraqis. And every one of those casualties is a human being with families and friends. And every one of those deaths is a tragedy. It is just so, it brings me to tears that it didn't have to be this way. But I genuinely hope that whatever the international community does decide to do can at least bring some peace to some part of their country. And I say to the Iraqi people, as I've said to them before, please forgive us for what we've done to increase their suffering over the last 11.5 years. Thanks, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member for Denison for his statement.